Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about how we can actually get to Angular 2. So I'm specifically going to be focusing on use cases for those of us who already have large, complex applications implemented in Angular 1. I'm going to talk about this from my perspective as a Google employee and talk about what we're doing in real applications at Google, and talk about how we can actually do this without driving ourselves completely crazy. I'm also going to walk through some sample code. So just to introduce myself, I'm a tech lead at Google, and I specifically work on cloud. So my team is an infrastructure team that focuses on front end. So we're responsible for things like Angular version migrations. Just to introduce our application a little bit, we have things like project dashboards, resource management, so be able to create and manipulate new VMs and databases. And we also work with things like logging and monitoring, so we have a lot of interactive features as well. We are a really big project. So at this point, we have somewhere around 450,000 lines of JavaScript and template code. Yes, that's really just source code, and that is excluding whitespace and comments. We have hundreds of reusable shared components and services, and we also are a really distributed community, so we have dozens of teams across multiple offices and time zones. Just to make things a little bit more complex, we also release twice a week. So that means that the head of our application has to be working all the time. So given that our project is this huge, why would we actually try and move the whole thing to Angular 2? Well, as most of you can probably guess, given today's focus, a lot of that has to do with performance. So Angular 2 is just a lot faster, and that's something that we really care about and that our users care about. All of those changes to move the change detection from that digest cycle to a one-way traversal makes a really big difference, and that's something that we're really looking forward to. We're also really excited about ahead-of-time template compilation. So with this turned on, the application doesn't have to compile in the user's browser anymore, and that saves us some time. But even more importantly, we don't have to ship the compiler to the user, and we get to ship a lot less code. So this means that Angular 2 will be a lot smaller. This is also really important because as we start talking about ng upgrade and running Angular 1 and 2 in the same page, this means that Angular 2 doesn't necessarily have to include an critical amount of new code in our application. So in a hello world, as you can see here, Angular 2 winds up being about 22K. Obviously, that might be a little bit more in a really complex application, but a sister project of ours has started working on migration, and they've found that their Angular 2 binary is only about 40K so far, which is terrific. We also get lazy loading out of the box. I'm really excited about this because this is something that we've implemented locally for Angular 1, but honestly, I would really like not to implement our own custom solution and have to maintain that. So I'm really happy that we'll be able to just get to use whatever the rest of the Angular 2 community is using. So it's great that that's built in. Okay, so let's just do it, right? This looks really great. We're just gonna rewrite all of our code. Maybe we'll just tell everybody, okay, we're not gonna ship for a while while we just rewrite everything. Okay, yeah, I'm not gonna get away with that. Okay, well, everybody can just maintain all of their new features in both Angular 1 and 2 until everybody's ready to ship, right? Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna get away with that. And if you're in such similar situations, you probably won't either. So what we really need is some kind of iterative strategy for migrating to Angular 2. And that's where ng upgrade comes in. So ng upgrade lets us actually run Angular 1 and 2 in parallel in our application. So we can take services and components that we've written in Angular 1 and use ng upgrade to upgrade them and make them available to the Angular 2 application, and vice versa. And this gives us an iterative update path. So there are a couple different ways that we might approach actually implementing our application. So one is we could take components and services, re-implement them, so rewrite them in Angular 2, and then downgrade them to Angular 1, and then that would allow us to include them in Angular 1 contexts. There are potentially a couple, excuse me, There are potentially a couple things that might be less ideal about this. So for us, we've had an application for a really long time, and this is a really good opportunity for us to do some refactoring, potentially change some of our APIs that we've been wanting to change for a while. And if we're trying to shoehorn these back into existing Angular 1 pages and maintain those same API layers, that's kind of hard to do. So one of the other strategies that I've heard some people talk about is kind of the opposite. So let's re-implement our page in Angular 2, and then we'll just take services and components, and before we completely rewrite them, we'll use ng upgrade to make them available to Angular 2. There are actually some limitations on what sort of components you can upgrade, but even beyond that, one of the reasons that we don't really want to go with this approach is we're rewriting our pages in Angular 2, but we're still going to have some sort of wrapper container that downgrades them to Angular 1, and then we're stuck with using the Angular 1 router. So if we have complex pages that have a lot of route setup, maybe they have some things like route resolve, we're going to actually have to go back and rewrite all of that route configuration. And if you have hundreds of pages, that's not something that you're going to want to have to redo. Also, we're really excited about the Angular 2 router features. So things like lazy loading are really important to us, as I mentioned before. There's also some nice features like some of the nested routing and just even features like route guard. So we really just want to be able to completely rewrite our pages with that new router. So instead, what we're going to do is, just like we're running Angular 1 and 2 in parallel, we're also going to run the Angular 1 and 2 routers in parallel. And that will allow us to completely rewrite our pages in Angular 2 one at a time, using the new router. And then if we need to, we can pull in some of the strategies that we talked about earlier. So say we have some service that we don't want to rewrite at that point, we can use ng upgrade to make that available to our new Angular 2 pages. OK, so let's take a look at what this actually looks like live. So I've made a little test application. Since I've been visiting Europe for most of the month, I made myself a little cheat sheet with some of the local football teams. So I could go in, take a look at some of the leagues, maybe look at what teams are there. I apologize sincerely if your favored team is not on here. I will absolutely accept pull requests. OK, so let's take a look at the code. Hang on, I'm going to see if I can get my display. Did that do it? OK. OK, I think that's going to be a little bit better. Thanks. So to power this application, it's pretty simple. Right now, it's all just Angular 1. So we've got a service. I've just hard-coded in a bunch of static data. This is where you can send me your pull requests. And then at the bottom here, you can see we've got a couple methods on our service. And then we've just got a little Angular module that's all ng1. It defines a service. Pretty simple. Similarly, we've got some Angular 1 route setup. We've got our normal route provider.when defining all of our routes. We've got some simple templates. And then we've got an Angular 1 app. So that's what everything is powering right now. So what I'd like to do now is change the bootstrap so that we're actually using Angular 2 alongside of Angular 1. So first, I'm going to show you a little bit of here. OK. So first, I'm going to show you a little bit of a diagram to explain how we're going to set this up. So we're going to keep our root application Angular 1, and that's just going to have the ng view that all of you have seen before. And for anything that's mapped in Angular 1's router, it's just going to do the thing that it's always done and render that page. If that route is not mapped by Angular 1 and we want it to be Angular 2 instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use this little wrapper component called ng2 router root. And all that does is add a router outlet to the page when we need it, and that's where Angular 2 is going to render its content. So if we go into this file, actually, let's go here first. So we've got a new component, and this is an Angular 2 component implemented in Angular 2. So here's the selector, ng2 router root that we mentioned, and then the template, all that has is router outlet. So pretty simple. And then we're gonna downgrade that to Angular 1. So we create a new Angular 1 module, and all that has is a new directive, and then the actual directive that we're passing in is just calling Angular 2's built-in downgrade component method. And I should mention that if some of you have played with Angular Upgrade in the past, this might look a little bit different. As of last week, there were some new updates to allow ahead-of-time compilation with ng Upgrade, so this is actually using that new code. And then down at the bottom, we're just saying, if you can't find an ng1 route configuration, go ahead and use this template. So that's all we have here. Going back to our Angular 2 module file, we have one other piece that we're not really using yet, but we have a custom URL handling strategy. And this doesn't necessarily need to be complex, but basically we need to tell Angular 2 which routes it should actually handle, because we don't want it to handle everything like it would by default. And then down at the bottom, we have an Angular 2 module, and this is going to be our root module for Angular 2. We pass in the browser module as normal. Right now, we're not defining any routes. We give it upgrade module because we're definitely using that. And then we just declare ng2 root module component and pass in that custom URL handling strategy. Our Bootstrap code is going to look a little more complex. But most of this is stuff that you can just copy paste into your application. So I copy pasted this out of the Angular code base. The important thing here is this last Bootstrap statement. So this is saying that, yes, we want to use the Angular web browser-based renderer. It's passing in the Angular 2 root module, saying render this at document.body, and then it's giving it our Angular 1 module. So that should be all we need to get Bootstrap set up. Actually, there's one other thing, which is we need to actually pull in that Angular 1 module. So I'm going to add that right here. And then I'll make that a dependency of this module. OK, and if I've done everything right, we should still have an application. And it looks like we do, so great. So let's take a look at what this is actually doing. This is going to be more helpful for the next step so that we can really get a sense of how our application is rendering. So I've written a couple really ugly CSS styles that highlight the ngView element and that custom element that we made. OK, so now we have a border showing us where the ngView is rendering. So let's go ahead and actually migrate some content to Angular 2 now. Since this talk isn't very long, I've taken the liberty of going ahead and implementing some code already. I didn't really want to take the time to rewrite our team service. So we're just going to use ng Upgrade to make that available for Angular 2. So down at the very bottom, we define a new Angular 2 module, and all we really need to do for this is say that we're providing this team service, and it's coming from the Angular 1 injector. So the reason this is a separate function is because once you start working with AOT, you actually do need this to be a completely separate function and be exported rather than just being declared in line here. But it's just saying, ask the Angular 1 injector for this thing. I've also gone ahead and rewritten the team section itself in Angular 2. So if we take a look at this, we can see that this is actually using the Angular 2 router. If I open one of these files, you can see it's using ng4, it's using the router link. It should look like a lot of the Angular 2 examples you've seen. So we're going to try and wire this up and see if we can get this working with the new Bootstrap. So first, since we're not going to use the Angular 1 implementation anymore, I'm going to delete that from our Angular 1 module. So that's gone now. And if we click on Teams, we shouldn't get anything anymore. OK, great. That's genuinely gone. Now I'm going to go and just add the Angular 2 module. And I still am not getting any content. And that's because Angular 2 doesn't actually know that it's supposed to be paying attention to this path yet. So we're going to go back into that custom URL handling strategy that I mentioned before. And certainly you could do something a little more sophisticated with this, but we're just doing a simple demo. So I'm just gonna take this, turn it into a string, and just check to see what it starts with. Okay. And there we go. So we already have an application that's rendering both Angular 1 and Angular 2 content with both routers at the same time. So just to show you this is really working, I'm going to click on one of these. You can see we're getting Angular 2 content. And if I click on this, we can even move back and forth between these applications. So we can pass links back and forth between Angular 1 and 2. Browser history works. Everything's looking good. So I mentioned before that we really want to adopt lazy loading. And if we look at this code right now, and I pull open this, you can see, actually, let's go back here. Okay, so let's load this page fresh. We're looking at the index page. And even though we're looking at this one page that doesn't require any of the Teams code, we're still downloading all of this code. So let's go ahead and adopt lazy loading. Before I actually implement that, I would like to talk just a little bit about how we actually structure these paths. So imagine that we have an application that has a bunch of paths, and all of those have subpaths. You could imagine some complex hierarchy here that matches your own application. If you've looked at Angular 2 examples, most of the simple examples declare a single route map, and then that's passed into router module.forRoute into the top level application. And that works really well. But if you have a lot of routes, this file is going to get really long. It's going to be difficult to read. It's going to be a pain to maintain. If you have a lot of developers working on this project, you may get a lot of merge conflicts. You may also have some ownership issues. So what we really want to do is start breaking out these routes into the features that they're associated with. And luckily, Angular does have a way to do that. So what we're going to do is instead use router module.forChild and pass it in a subsection of those routes. So we can start splitting up our route definitions. And if we use that strategy, these things all just kind of get merged together. And that does work well, but if we have really deep hierarchies, this can get a little bit awkward because we're having to specify this from the very root of the application every time. And that means that, say, I have a bunch of different child modules and they all share a common root node. If I wanted to change that path, I'm going to have to change that everywhere in all of these files. So one thing that we can do is instead kind of load that child into the place where it goes in the path hierarchy, and then those paths actually become relative. So that's the strategy that we're going to use here. So here we're saying load children is the child module, and I'll show you what this looks like in our code. So we've got that set up with our code already. So we're saying our root path for this is Teams. So that is the URL right here. And then you can see that this is an empty string. If you're coming from Angular 1, this may feel a little bit confusing, but we're basically mapping nodes. So we're not saying like /teams/ whatever. We're saying Teams, and then under that, we're not expanding this. This is just the same path. So you'll see this doesn't have a trailing slash. And then we're also mapping to team ID, and that's this path. So actually, all we need to do to move this to lazy loading is change this function right here to be a string. So I'm going to use the path to this file. Oops. And then I'll just do the same thing for this one. And there we go. OK. And now that we're using lazy loading, we don't actually want to import these two modules into this component because that would keep the code associated. So we're going to pull this association out so that this can really only be loaded when we need it. So just to make sure that this is really working, let's go to the Network tab I'm going to pull this up so that you can see it, clear everything out. And then if I click on Teams, we should get all that code downloaded on demand. And we did not. This is the problem with live demos, right? Let's try this one more time. There we go. OK. So this time you saw the detail one loaded. Just so that you really believe me, I'll do it right from the beginning. OK, so there we go. So we're actually getting both the team list and the team detail loaded completely on demand, lazily. And so at this point, we actually have a module per page. So we can have as much fine-grained control as we like, which is really great. So there are a couple last thoughts that I wanted to leave you with to get you sped on your way. So one is, it's really important to remember with lazy loading that only those two root injectors are talking to each other. So you might have some code that's only needed by the child injector, but if you're using it with ng upgrade, you can't lazily load that because Angular 1 doesn't know anything about lazy loading. So if we go back to our example and look at this team module, you can see that I actually have team service module imported into the root module rather than the child modules, because those are going to be lazily loaded and this would break. We also need to make sure that these resources are still included in Angular 1. So even though we're not actually using any of this code in the Angular 1 Teams module anymore because we removed that, we still have it in the application itself. So if we open up this module, we're still including that team service module in our Angular 1 root application. Another cautionary note is that if you have really old, complicated directives that use the $ compile service, you can't use those with ng upgrade. So you're not going to be able to upgrade those to Angular 2. If you have newer directives that are actually the Angular 1.5 components, those will work. And finally, for the most part, I've had pretty good luck upgrading services, but one thing to keep in mind is if you have some code that maybe is listening to the route change success event or something else from the router, if you're on an Angular 2 page, those events aren't firing anymore because you're outside of the Angular 1 router, so you're going to have to wire up something different for those. You're going to have to separately listen to the Angular 2 route change events. So that is all I have today. I know that I went through a lot of code pretty quickly, but this is all on GitHub. If you want to take a look and play with this yourself, the master branch is all Angular 1, so that's the start of the presentation, and then the ng2 branch is the end. I'm going to continue trying to update this application over the next week or so. I'll try and get the sample AOT configuration working in there so that you can see all these things together. And whenever I get that set up, I'll send that out on Twitter. Thank you all so much.